Well, we acquired the Gilbert White manuscript in 1980. It was quite an eventful spring. We started off with a temporary exhibition in April on Professor Thomas Bell, who bought the house when it passed out to the White family. And in the point of researching on Bell, who was a dental surgeon in London, I was in touch with Ian Lyle, who was a great Gilbert White book collector, as well as being deputy librarian at the Royal College of Surgeons. And I was researching on Bell as a dental surgeon, and in one of the letters from Ian Lyle, there was a PS to one of them which said, "I hear on good evidence that Gilbert White's original manuscript is coming to this country for sale." And I then wrote back to say, "Keep me informed." Well, he followed it up with his sources of good evidence, and I duly reported, and it was due for sale in June at Christie's. There was a catalogue advertised, so I promptly acquired the catalogue, and I went to see it in the Christie's room. Then we had to. We had a trustees meeting at the beginning of May, and I logged the fact that Gilbert White's manuscript was coming up for sale, and I tabled the catalogue, and the starting price was about 20,000. Well, at the time, the museum finances were a little low, which is quite a normal thing, and so the decision was, well, this is outside our league. Curator to contact British Library to persuade them to buy it. So I promptly made an appointment with Daniel Whaley, who was the head of Western Manuscripts in the British Library, and went up to see him, and I did manage to persuade him that yes, it was of national importance, and yes, the British Library would go for it. So that was that issue sort of seemingly dealt with. Then Ian Lyle came up with the idea of the British Library were getting a little bit worried because that particular summer there were a lot of large auctions with important items they were wanting to bid for, and of course they only had a limited stretch of funds. So Ian Lyle suggested that we did a letter in the Times. So I promptly rang the editor of the letters page and explained it, and he said, "Well, we don't normally do appeals, but this one makes an interesting story, so go ahead, get it in the post." So I promptly got it in the post, and the next day I wasn't. I worked a 4-day week at the museum, and I wasn't actually due in on the day in which it was due to be published. But I went down to Alton and picked up a copy of the Times, and there it was. But then I realised I had to go into the museum, and when I went in, the telephone was going flat out all day, and we had a notepad by it with taking details of people who had promised something towards the manuscript fund, and then the charities started piling in and saying, "Will 5,000 do?" Which was rather a larger amount for the odd £5 here and £10 there, which came from the general public. But we got a general nucleus of about 400 in small offerings, and then the charitable trust came in. So I reported to Daniel Whaley that our supporting fund was going very well. Well, there was one problem with that, and that is that the red tape in British Library meant they couldn't really accept donations. And then also, the British Library also getting cold feet because they were aware that this would come for a very large sum, and what they had allocated for it would obviously be not enough. So he then said, "Well, you're stronger than us now," because we had raised with individual subscriptions and charitable trusts coming in just in response to the Times letter. So we then said, well, we've made 40,000, and the National Manuscript Fund runs at the Victoria and Albert Museum said, well, we make it up to 80. So immediately we had overtopped the 67, I think it was, which British Library were able to do. Well, this put me into a bit of a dilemma. So back to the trustees, and my usual contact in those days was Lord Selborne. So I rang him in the evening when I got back from London to say, I'm afraid the ball has been put back into our court. And I explained the situation. And he said, well, leave it with me, but I think we should go for this. And he managed to bring the other trustees on board. So there we were with a bid of about 80,000, and Robert Kirkman from Sutherland's, the managing director of Sutherland's in Sackville Street, Piccadilly, a second-hand antique bookshop there, volunteered to do the bidding free of charge. So that was another useful asset. And then we started having a few more things in. The publisher Mitchell Beasley bailed in something as well, with the possible idea of publishing a facsimile, which actually in the fullness of time never came to be. And then we were coming up towards the end of May when I was deputising for Jenny Streeter, who was ill at the time, in the Field Study Centre, and I had a whole class full of junior school children all looking at mini beasts in trays under microscopes, and oh look, it's ate one, oh look, it's eaten another one, and there was quite a lot of liveliness going on there. And the telephone rang, so I went into Jenny's office and picked up the phone, and it was the National Heritage Memorial Fund. They'd only just set themselves up, and they hadn't actually got any forms or anything to their name. But they wanted to know more, and I explained the story to them, and I did say, well, I did hear that it's likely to go for a very large sum. And they said, well, this is what we're in the business to help with. So count yourself into the auction for 100,000. So that was and then a few more came trickling in after that, because it wasn't just the original manuscript which we had our eye on. There was also a set of Gilbert White, a book of Gilbert White's personal accounts, which had a lot of research mileage in, which would like to get our hands on. And there's also, for some curious reason, the introduction to the original manuscript had been bound up separately, and that came as a separate lot. So anyway, we needed that little bit more than 100,000. But anyway, on the day of the auction, I went up to London, and Robert Sackville had me in his office to give me his tactics, and said, well, don't worry if I don't start bidding straight away, because I know that there's going to be very strong bidding at this auction, so I want to keep the atmosphere low, and we'll let all the small fry work their way out of the system. And then we'll jump in later on as we've got a serious hand to play. And so off it went, and the hammer went, and the auction started going, 20,000, and it just rolled up to about 60,000 before you could almost blink. And then things started quietening down as Robert Kirkman had suggested. The small fry had worked their way out of the system. And then towards the end, it was just us and one other bidder, and there was a 95,000, I think it was, which came on, and then we put our final one in for 100,000, and the hammer went down to us. So that was successful, and then the introduction came up. And we had got some money left over from additional funds which had come in subsequent to the Heritage Lottery Fund, and so we started bidding for the introduction. But that one that one had no research mileage. It really was a collector's piece. It had no research mileage in it at all. And so at 5,000, I signified to Robert Kirkman to pull out, because I didn't want to jeopardise getting the account books, which we did successfully lasso. Well, so there we are. So on the next day in the Time, oh yes, and there was television cameras all around, and I gather I was on Television South and various other television channels, which of course I never saw. And then the next day, there was on the front page of the Times was a coup on the part of British Heritage, and telling the story of the successful acquisition of the Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne original manuscript by the Gilbert White Museum. And then after that, Robert Kirkman started investigating on the person who actually bid for us, who outbid us on the introduction. So he then got in touch, and it was a dealer who was working on behalf of an American visitor, and we were wondering whether we might be able to borrow it, or to at least have a copy made of it before it was shipped off to the States. Anyway, this American visitor was mortified that he had beaten the Gilbert White Museum to the introduction, and he gave it to us. So that was the manuscript, and the introduction have now lodged in Selborne. And then we also did manage to lasso the account books as well. And then I was hoping that Mitchell Beazley would have done a facsimile edition, and I did go to the Charles Darwin Museum at Down in Kent, because they had produced a facsimile of Darwin's Beagle voyages, but it was very difficult to actually do it. It was very expensive, etc. So that one didn't work out in the end. But of course, these days, and we didn't have a computer in the building in the 1980s, and none of us on the staff in 1980 had personal computers in those days. But these days it has now been scanned, and it's available on the museum website, so it is generally available.